Salt Lake Valley, Utah Territory. July 1865, the dusk came first. A wall of it rising from the west like God's own curtain being drawn across the valley. Sarah Sullivan stood on the porch of their homestead, shading her eyes against the setting sun as she watched the approaching storm. 4 months since the war had ended back east. Though news traveled slow to Utah, her husband Thomas had never fought. The Normans had largely stayed out of the conflict, but times were hard nonetheless. James, Elizabeth, Samuel, she called, her voice carrying across the yard where her 3 children had been playing. Come inside now. Storm's coming. At 32, Sarah had the weathered look of a frontier woman. Life in Utah Territory demanded resilience. The children appeared from behind the barn, James, the oldest at 12, herding his younger siblings toward the house. How bad will it be, Ma? James asked, his eyes serious beyond his years. Sarah ran a hand through his sandy hair. Bad enough. Your father should be back from town soon. Help me close the shutters. Elizabeth, 9, clutched her rag doll to her chest. I don't like the dust storms, she whispered, her blue eyes wide with apprehension. I know, sweetheart, Sarah replied, ushering the children inside. Samuel, stop dawdling. Samuel, just 6, and always curious, lingered by the porch steps, watching the approaching wall with fascination. The boy had a wildness to him that neither James's seriousness nor Elizabeth's gentleness possessed. Samuel, his mother's sharp tone finally pulled him inside. Thomas Sullivan arrived just as the first gusts hit the homestead, his wagon kicking up smaller clouds of dust as he urged the horses into the barn. A tall man with a beard streaked with premature gray. He hurried to secure the animals before fighting his way to the house against the increasingly violent wind. It's going to be a bad one, he announced as he burst through the door, bringing a swirl of dust with him despite his efforts. The Jensen place lost half their roof in the last storm. Hutchinson says it's the driest summer he can recall. Sarah handed him a damp cloth to wipe his face. We've sealed up as best we can. The wind howled around the corners of the house as darkness fell, not the gentle darkness of evening, but the smothering blackness of the dust storm. The family huddled in the main room, lamps burning low to conserve oil. Elizabeth clung to her mother while Samuel fidgeted restlessly. Tell us a story, Pa, James requested, always trying to maintain calm for his siblings. Thomas cleared his throat, settling into his chair. Well, when I first came to the valley with the Saints... double quotes, the storm intensified, rattling the shutters and howling like a living thing. Dust seeped through every crack, coating surfaces with fine powder. Sarah coughed, covering her mouth with a handkerchief. Maybe we should pray, Elizabeth suggested in a small voice. The family bowed their heads as Thomas led them in prayer, his deep voice barely audible over the storm's fury. Outside, something crashed against the side of the house, making them all jump. Just a branch, Thomas assured them, but his eyes met Sarah's with concern. The night wore on, the storm showing no signs of abating. Eventually, the children fell into uneasy sleep. James on the floor near the fireplace, Elizabeth curled against her mother on the settee, and Samuel wrapped in a blanket near his father's chair. None of them heard the strange scratching at the window behind the shutters, or noticed how the dust seemed to form peculiar shapes as it swirled beneath the door. By midnight, the worst seemed to have passed. The howling diminished to a low moan, and the scratching of dust against the walls lessened. Thomas and Sarah, exhausted but relieved, carried their children to their beds. Thank the Lord it's passing, Sarah whispered as they returned to their own bed. But in the darkness outside, something waited, patient, hungry, ancient. Dawn broke with an eerie stillness. Thomas rose first, moving quietly through the dust-coated house to check the damage. Sarah joined him as he stood in the open doorway, surveying their property. Lord have mercy, she breathed. The landscape had been transformed. Drifts of dust, some nearly 3 feet high, surrounded the house and outbuildings. The garden Sarah had tended so carefully was buried. The chicken coop had partially collapsed. We'll manage, Thomas said firmly, though his eyes betrayed his worry. The animals first, then we'll dig out. Sarah nodded, turning back to wake the children. She climbed the narrow stairs to the loft where all 3 children slept. Rise and shine, she called, her voice falsely cheerful. We've work to do after... The words died in her throat. The beds were empty, all 3 of them. Thomas... Her scream brought her husband pounding up the stairs. They're gone. The children are gone. Thomas stared at the empty beds, confusion clouding his face. They must have risen early. Perhaps they're already outside. But even as he said it, they both knew. James was responsible, Elizabeth cautious, and even Wild Samuel wouldn't have ventured out without permission after such a storm. They searched the house anyway, calling their children's names with increasing desperation. Nothing. No sign of them in the dust-filled rooms. They must be outside. They must be, Sarah insisted, her voice rising with panic as they burst through the door into the yard. James, Elizabeth, Samuel. Thomas's voice boomed across the property. Only silence answered him. They separated, Thomas checking the barn while Sarah ran to the chicken coop, calling frantically. The dust made the search difficult, obscuring landmarks and drifting in mounds that had to be climbed or circumvented. Thomas emerged from the barn, his face grim. The horses are still there, agitated but secure. Could someone have taken them? Sarah asked, clutching his arm as they reunited in the yard. In that storm? Impossible. And look, Thomas pointed to the ground around the house. No tracks. Not a single footprint besides our own. It was true. The dust lay smooth and undisturbed around the house, as if no one had passed that way since the storm. But that was impossible. If the children had left the house, there would be tracks. The storm must have filled them in, Sarah reasoned desperately. All of them? Without a trace? Thomas shook his head, his expression darkening. This isn't natural, Sarah. They spent the morning searching every inch of their property, then widened their search to the surrounding fields. By noon, Thomas hitched the wagon. I'm going to the neighbors, then to town if needed. We'll form a search party. Sarah nodded, her face streaked with dust and tears. I'll keep looking here. They might return. After Thomas departed, Sarah continued her search, calling until her voice grew hoarse. She returned to the house repeatedly, hoping beyond hope to find her children had somehow reappeared. Each time she was met with empty rooms and silence. As she re-entered the house in the late afternoon, something caught her eye. On the wooden floor of the children's bedroom, barely visible in the dust, were strange markings. Not footprints, but long, sinuous lines, as if something had been dragged or had slithered across the floor. Sarah stared, her blood running cold. She hadn't noticed them earlier in her panic. Kneeling, she traced the markings with trembling fingers. They led from the children's beds to the window, which was still shuttered from the inside. A sound from downstairs made her freeze. A soft scraping, like fingers dragging across wood. Hello? She called, her voice barely above a whisper. James? Elizabeth? Samuel? The scraping stopped. Then came a soft, sibilant sound, like someone drawing in a long, rattling breath. Thomas Sullivan returned at dusk with 5 men from neighboring homesteads. Their grim faces told Sarah they'd found nothing. We'll begin again at first light, Jedediah Ambrose, their closest neighbor, assured her. More men coming from town tomorrow. Thomas took Sarah aside while the men conferred in the yard. What is it? He asked, noting her pallid face and wide eyes. Did something happen? She told him about the strange markings in the children's room and the sounds she'd heard. I'm not imagining it, Thomas, she insisted when doubt flickered across his face. He squeezed her hand. I believe you're upset, as am I, but there must be a rational explanation. Show me these markings, Jedediah interrupted. The older man had been in Utah Territory longer than most, having arrived with the first Mormon settlers. He had a reputation for wisdom, some said second sight. Sarah led them upstairs. The markings remained, faint but visible in the dust. Jedediah knelt, studying them in silence, his weathered face inscrutable. What do you make of it? Thomas asked finally. Jedediah stood slowly, his joints creaking. I've seen something like this before. Years back, during the crossing, a family's children vanished one night during a dust storm near the Devil's Gate Passage. What happened to them? Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. Jedediah avoided her eyes. They were never found. But the Shoshone spoke of something that lives in the dust. Something old. They called it Ishativa, the hunger in the wind. Thomas scoffed. Indian superstitions. Perhaps, Jedediah conceded. The Shoshone avoided certain areas during dust storms. They said the hunger was strongest then, when it could move freely in the swirling dust. This is nonsense, Thomas declared, though his voice lacked conviction. My children were taken by someone, or perhaps wandered off confused after the storm. With no tracks? Jedediah countered softly. I don't claim to know what happened, Thomas. I'm merely telling you what I've heard. That night, after the search party departed, promising to return at dawn, Thomas and Sarah sat in painful silence by the fire. Neither could bring themselves to retire to bed while their children were missing. We should pray, Thomas said finally, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. As they bowed their heads, the wind began to rise outside, not with the fury of the previous night's storm, but with a low, persistent moan that somehow sounded ... satisfied. Sarah's head snapped up. Did you hear that? A soft thump came from upstairs, as if something had fallen, then another. Thomas grabbed the lamp and they rushed to the stairs. The children's room was empty, but something had changed. 3 small piles of dust had appeared on the floor, one near each bed. And on the window, previously shuttered and secure, they found it, a handprint. Small, like a child's, pressed against the glass from the outside. "Samuel," Sarah whispered, recognizing the size. Thomas threw open the shutters and pushed open the window. Nothing but darkness and the softly moaning wind. But as he leaned out, peering into the night, a fine stream of dust blew into his face, making him cough and stumble back. "There's nothing out there," he said, wiping his streaming eyes. But Sarah was staring at the floor. The 3 small dust piles had changed. They were spreading, forming those same sinuous patterns she'd seen earlier, but now they were moving toward the bedroom door. Toward them. "Thomas," she gasped, pointing. The dust moved with purpose, curling and twisting across the wooden floorboards like living things. And as they watched in horror, the patterns began to take shape, 3 distinct silhouettes. Child-sized, but distorted, elongated. From downstairs came the sound of the front door creaking open, though they had barred it before coming up. A cold draft swept through the house, carrying with it the smell of dust and something else, something ancient and hungry. "The children," Sarah whispered, her maternal instinct overcoming her fear. She lunged forward, reaching toward the nearest dust formation. "James." Thomas grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "That's not our children," he said, his voice shaking. "Sarah, that's not them." The dust patterns paused, then rose, not scattering as dust should, but holding their forms as they lifted from the floor. 3 vaguely child-shaped columns of swirling dust, topped by approximations of heads that slowly turned toward the parents. From these shapes came a sound, not quite voices, but a sighing, whispering noise that chilled Thomas and Sarah to their bones. "Ma, pa." The words were barely discernible, formed from the sound of dust particles rushing against each other. "Don't listen," Jedediah Ambrose warned, his voice startling Thomas and Sarah. The old man stood in the bedroom doorway, a leather-bound Bible clutched in one hand, a shotgun in the other. "Those aren't your children speaking." "How did you?" Thomas began, but Jedediah cut him off. "I knew I shouldn't have left you alone. I felt it, the wrongness in the air." The old man stepped forward, placing himself between the Sullivans and the dust formations. "Back, Ishativa. You have no claim here." The dust shapes wavered, then seemed to grow more substantial. The whispering intensified, taking on a mocking tone. The middle shape, the one approximately Elizabeth's, extended what might have been an arm, reaching toward Sarah. Help us, Ma, we're lost, double quotes," Sarah sobbed, instinctively moving toward the sound of her daughter's voice, but Thomas held her firmly. "What is happening?" he demanded of Jedediah. "What are these things?" "The hunger takes many forms," Jedediah replied, his eyes never leaving the dust shapes. "It feeds on loss, on grief. It took your children in the storm, and now it wears their shapes to feed on your despair." The largest shape, James-sized, moved closer, dust swirling more violently within its form. Pa. Why did you leave us? Why didn't you protect us?" Thomas flinched as if struck. "I didn't. I wouldn't. Don't engage," Jedediah warned. "It knows your fears, your guilt. It will use them against you." The smallest shape, Samuel, had begun to circle around, attempting to flank them. Its movements were jerky, inhuman, despite its childlike form. "We need to leave this house," Jedediah said. "Now, I won't leave without my children," Sarah insisted, struggling against Thomas's restraining arm. "These aren't your children," Jedediah repeated firmly. "Your children might still be alive, but we won't find them here." The dust shapes surged forward simultaneously, their forms elongating, becoming less human and more serpentine. The whispering rose to a shriek, dust swirling violently around the room, stinging their eyes and choking their lungs. Thomas dragged Sarah toward the door as Jedediah raised his shotgun. The blast was deafening in the confined space, the buckshot tearing through the largest dust shape, dispersing it momentarily before it began to reform. "It won't kill them, but it'll slow them down," Jedediah shouted over the howling dust. "Move!" They stumbled down the stairs, dust swirling around them, plucking at their clothes and hair with surprising strength. The front door slammed shut as they approached, though no one was near it. The back way, Thomas redirected them, pulling Sarah through the kitchen. Outside, the night was alive with wind, though the sky remained clear and star-filled. Not a natural storm, but something else, something focused entirely on their homestead. They ran toward Jedediah's horse, tethered near the barn. Behind them, the house seemed to pulse with an inner light, dust streaming from every window and door to form a churning cloud above the roof. "Where are we going?" Sarah cried as Thomas lifted her onto the horse behind Jedediah. "The settlement at Devil's Gate," the old man replied. "There's someone there who might help a Shoshone woman who's seen this before." Thomas hesitated, looking back at the house, their home, where just yesterday his family had been whole. "My children, if they live, will find them," Jedediah promised. "But not tonight. Not here." As Thomas climbed up behind Sarah, the dust cloud above their house contracted suddenly, then exploded outward in 3 distinct streams, moving toward them with impossible speed. "Ride," Thomas shouted. Jedediah spurred the horse, which bolted forward with a terrified whinny. The streams of dust pursued them across the darkened landscape, moving faster than any natural phenomenon should. As they crested a ridge, Sarah looked back one last time. In the moonlight, she could see their homestead surrounded by swirling dust. And standing before the house, 3 small figures, too distant to make out clearly, but child-sized and still. For a moment, the smallest figure seemed to raise its hand, as if waving goodbye. Then the dust engulfed the figures, and there was nothing to see but the wind-whipped landscape and the hungry dark. Devil's Gate, Wyoming Territory. 3 days later, the settlement at Devil's Gate consisted of little more than a trading post, stables, and a handful of crude cabins clustered near the narrow passage where the Sweetwater River had carved through solid granite. The imposing rock formations that gave the place its name loomed over everything, casting long shadows in the late afternoon sun. Thomas, Sarah, and Jedediah arrived exhausted, their clothes caked with dust, eyes red-rimmed from weeping and lack of sleep. The journey had been arduous, made worse by their constant fear of the pursuing dust, a fear that proved founded when swirling dust clouds appeared on the horizon each night, only to disperse with the morning light. "This woman," Thomas said as they dismounted at the trading post, "you're certain she can help?" Jedediah's face was grim. "I make no promises, but Juanetta knows the old ways better than any. If your children can be found, she'll know how." Sarah hadn't spoken since they'd left their homestead. The horror of that night, the dust shapes mimicking her children, the whispering voices, had pushed her into a state of shocked silence that worried Thomas more than anything. "And if they can't be found?" Thomas asked quietly, helping Sarah down from the horse. Jedediah didn't answer. The trading post's proprietor, a grizzled man named Harlan Weeks, greeted them with suspicion that turned to concern when he recognized Jedediah. "Ambrose? What brings you this far north? And in such a state?" Jedediah explained their situation in hushed tones while Thomas settled Sarah on a bench outside. Weeks's expression grew increasingly troubled. "Juanetta's camped up by the high creek," he said finally. "But I warn you, she doesn't much care for white folks these days. Not since the army's been pushing her people further west." "Tell her it's about the Ishativa," Jedediah replied. "She see us." Weeks disappeared into the back of the trading post, returning moments later with a young half-Shoshone boy. "Caleb here will take you to her, but mind yourselves. There's been strange happenings around these parts lately." The boy led them along a narrow trail that wound up through scrubby pine and aspen stands. He moved quickly despite his apparent youth, glancing back occasionally to ensure they followed. "What strange happenings?" Thomas asked, breaking the tense silence. The boy hesitated, then replied in perfect English, "People gone missing. Like your children, mister. It's 3 so far." Thomas felt Sarah's grip on his arm tighten painfully. "When? Last 2 months?" "After dust storms." The boy pointed ahead to a small clearing where smoke rose from a lodge. "Juanetta is there. She's been expecting you." This last statement sent a chill through Thomas, but he pressed on, supporting Sarah as they entered the clearing. Juanetta sat before her lodge, an elderly woman with a deeply lined face and iron-gray hair braided with small bones and beads. She didn't rise as they approached, merely watching them with obsidian eyes that seemed to pierce through to Thomas's soul. "The dust has followed you," she said without preamble, her voice surprisingly strong. "I can smell it on you." Jedediah stepped forward, removing his hat. "These good people have lost their children to the Ishativa. I told them you might help." Juanetta's gaze shifted to Sarah, whose silence seemed to interest her. "The mother has touched it," she observed. "It has tasted her grief. Can you help us find our children?" Thomas asked, struggling to keep the desperation from his voice. Juanetta gestured for them to sit. "The Ishativa is very old. It was here before my people, before any people. It lives in the dust and moves with the wind, feeding on sorrow and fear." Her eyes narrowed. "It takes what is precious and keeps it between worlds." "Between worlds?" Thomas repeated. "I don't understand." "Not dead, not alive," Juanetta explained. "Like dreaming, but never waking. The Ishativa keeps them there, feeding on their terror and their parents' grief until nothing remains but dust." Sarah made a small, wounded sound, the first noise she'd uttered in days. But there is a way to find this place between worlds? Thomas pressed. Juanetta nodded slowly. There is a way, but it is dangerous. Some who go do not return, and those who do are changed. I don't care about the danger, Thomas said firmly. There are children. It is not your journey to make, Juanetta replied, her gaze shifting to Sarah. It must be the mother. The Ishatava has already tasted her grief. It will recognize her. Thomas began to protest, but Sarah placed a hand on his arm. I'll go, she said, her voice hoarse from disuse. Tell me how. Night fell over Devil's Gate, bringing with it a chorus of coyote calls and the soft rushing of the Sweetwater River. Inside Juanetta's lodge, Sarah sat motionless as the Shoshone woman prepared her for the journey. The dust is the key, Juanetta explained, crushing dried herbs into a small clay bowl. It is the Ishativa's body, its blood, its breath. To find your children, you must become like dust. Thomas watched from the lodge entrance, his expression torn between hope and fear. Jedediah had warned him that Shoshone medicine was powerful but unpredictable. Are you certain this is safe? He asked for the third time. Juanetta's weathered face remained impassive. Nothing about the Ishativa is safe, but your wife's bond to her children is strong. It may be enough to guide her. She mixed the crushed herbs with water from a leather flask, creating a muddy paste that she began applying to Sarah's face in intricate patterns. The Ishativa exists in the spaces between earth and sky, between life and death, between waking and dreaming. To reach it, one must enter these in-between places. Outside, the wind began to rise, sighing around the lodge. Thomas tensed. Is it not yet? Juanetta interrupted. But it comes. It has followed your trail, as I said it would. It is curious. She finished painting Sarah's face and hands, then removed a small deerskin pouch from around her neck. From it, she extracted a pinch of fine, reddish dust, which she sprinkled into the fire. The flames turned briefly blue, filling the lodge with sweet-smelling smoke. Breathe deeply, she instructed Sarah. See with more than your eyes. Hear with more than your ears. Sarah inhaled the smoke, her eyes fixed on some distant point Thomas couldn't see. Her pupils dilated until her eyes seemed almost black. They're calling me, she whispered. I can hear them. Thomas moved to her side, taking her hand. Sarah, no. Juanetta's sharp command stopped him. Do not break the connection. She walks the edge now. The wind outside intensified, moaning around the lodge poles. Dust seeped through the seams of the structure, forming small eddies on the earthen floor. It is here, Juanetta said, her voice dropping to a whisper. It smells the mother's yearning. Sarah's breathing had become shallow, her body rigid. James, she murmured. Elizabeth. Samuel. I'm coming. Thomas watched helplessly as his wife slipped further into her trance. The rational part of his mind, the part shaped by years of Mormon teaching and frontier pragmatism, insisted this was madness, superstition. Yet he had seen the dust take shapes, had heard it speak with his children's voices. What happens now? He asked Juanetta. We wait, and we protect her body while her spirit searches. The old woman reached into another pouch, withdrawing a handful of small, smooth stones that she placed in a circle around Sarah. The Ishativa will try to take her too. It is greedy. Outside, the wind had risen to a howl reminiscent of the storm that had taken their children. Dust poured through every crack in the lodge now, forming small cyclones that danced around the edges of Juanetta's stone circle. It knows, she said grimly. It knows she's trying to reach them. Sarah's head snapped back suddenly, her eyes flying open, but they were no longer her eyes. They had become pools of swirling dust, miniature cyclones contained within her skull. Sarah! Thomas lunged forward, but Jedediah held him back. Trust the medicine, the old man counseled. Trust Juanetta, the Shoshone woman had begun to chant in her native tongue, shaking a small rattle made of tortoiseshell over Sarah's rigid form. The dust cyclones intensified, pressing against the invisible boundary created by the stone circle. Sarah spoke, but it wasn't her voice. It was three voices, childish and frightened, speaking in unison. Ma, help us. It's so cold here, so dark. Thomas fell to his knees. James? Elizabeth? Samuel, can you hear me? They cannot, Juanetta said between chants. Only the mother can reach them now. The lodge poles creaked ominously as the wind battered the structure. One of the support poles splintered with a crack like gunfire, causing the entire lodge to list to one side. Dust poured through the new opening, coalescing into a towering column just beyond the stone circle. The column began to take shape, a grotesque approximation of a human form, too tall, too thin, its proportions all wrong. Where its face should be, there was only a swirling vortex of dust. Ishativa, Juanetta acknowledged, her voice steady despite the fear evident in her eyes. You are not welcome here. The dust shape extended an impossibly long arm towards Sarah, its fingers elongating into talon-like protrusions. It made no sound, but the wind outside seemed to form words. Mine. They are mine, ... double. Quotes. Thomas grabbed a burning brand from the fire, thrusting it toward the dust shape. Get back. You'll not take my wife as well. The shape recoiled from the flame, but only momentarily. It circled the stone boundary, searching for weakness, for a way to reach Sarah's vulnerable form. Inside the circle, Sarah convulsed suddenly, her back arching off the ground. I see them, she cried, her voice her own again. They're in a cave. No, not a cave. A space. Dark, full of dust. Others, too. So many others. Ask where, Juanetta urged. The Ishativa must keep its captives somewhere in our world. Where are you? Sarah called into the air. James, where are you? The dust entity shrieked, a sound like sandpaper against bone. It flung itself against the invisible barrier, causing the stones to vibrate across the earthen floor. Devil's Gate, Sarah gasped. They're in the rock at Devil's Gate, in a chamber. An opening. Where the wind blows through the stone, ... double quotes. The dust entity abandoned all semblance of human form, expanding into a roiling mass that engulfed the entire lodge. The remaining poles cracked under the onslaught, the lodge covering beginning to tear away. We must go, Juanetta commanded, gathering her medicine pouch. Now, while it rages, it will try to stop us from reaching the gate. But Sarah, Thomas protested. Bring her. The trance will hold until we reach the place she's seen. Thomas lifted his wife's rigid form as Jedediah helped. Juanetta gathered her ceremonial items. Together they burst from the collapsing lodge into the howling night. The wind tried to tear them apart as they struggled down the trail toward Devil's Gate. Dust swirled around them in blinding clouds, stinging their eyes and choking their lungs. Thomas carried Sarah, whose body remained rigid in its trance state, her eyes still those disturbing pools of swirling dust. Stay together, Jedediah shouted over the wind's howl. It's trying to separate us. Juanetta led the way, surprisingly spry for her age, clutching a medicine bundle that occasionally emitted flashes of blue light when the dust pressed too close. The entity had abandoned its humanoid shape, becoming a maelstrom that surrounded them on all sides, searching for weakness. How much further? Thomas called, staggering under Sarah's weight and the wind's relentless push. The narrow passage, Juanetta replied, pointing toward the looming silhouette of Devil's Gate, the place where stone meets sky. They pressed on, following a trail that had become nearly invisible in the swirling dust. Twice, Thomas nearly lost his footing on the steep descent, saved only by Jedediah's steadying hand. The dust storm intensified as they neared the gate, as if the entity recognized their destination and sought to prevent them from reaching it. From the maelstrom came sounds, children crying, voices calling for help, the scrape of fingernails on stone. Do not listen, Juanetta warned. It will use any means to weaken your resolve. The narrow passage of Devil's Gate appeared before them, a cleft in the granite where the Sweetwater River had carved its way through the ridge. During the day, it was an impressive but natural formation. By night, with the dust entity swirling around it, it seemed like the entrance to another world. "Oh, there," Sarah whispered suddenly, her body convulsing in Thomas's arms. "I can feel them. Under the stone." Juanetta directed them to a narrow crevice at the base of the south wall, barely visible in the darkness. The old one spoke of caves beneath the gate, places where the wind speaks. Thomas set Sarah down gently against the rock face. Her eyes had closed again, but her breathing was rapid, her skin hot to the touch despite the cool night air. "What now?" he asked, having to shout over the ever-increasing wind. "We must open the way," Juanetta replied. Removing items from her medicine bundler, small clay pot, a knife with a bone handle, several dark stones. The dust entity seemed to contract suddenly, gathering itself into a dense cloud directly above them. The wind's howl became a scream of rage. "It knows what we intend," Jedediah observed grimly. "We'd best hurry." Juanetta worked quickly, placing the stones in a pattern before the crevice, then opening the clay pot to reveal a paste similar to what she had applied to Sarah's face. She began marking the rock around the crevice with swift, sure strokes. "The mother's blood will open the way," she said, turning to Thomas with the bone knife extended. "It must be freely given." Thomas nodded without hesitation, extending his palm. Juanetta made a swift cut across it, catching the welling blood in the clay pot and mixing it with the paste. The entity's fury redoubled, the wind becoming so intense that they had to brace themselves against the rock face to avoid being blown away. Dust clawed at them like solid fingers, trying to drag them from the shelter of the overhang. Juanetta applied the blood-mixed paste to the edges of the crevice, chanting in a language older than Shoshone sounds that seemed to vibrate in the air long after she uttered them. As she worked, the crevice began to widen, not naturally as rock splitting, but as if the stone itself were dissolving. Sarah moaned, her back arching. "They're here," she gasped. "So close. James. He's trying to reach me." The crevice widened enough to reveal a dark passage beyond, from which emanated a cold draft that smelled of dust and age and something else, something Thomas's mind refused to identify. "I'll go," he declared, retrieving the torch he'd carried from Juaneta's lodge. "No," Juaneta countered. "The mother has made the connection. She must complete the journey. She can barely stand," Thomas protested. As if in response to his words, Sarah's eyes flew open, her normal blue eyes now, not the swirling dust vortices. She struggled to her feet, swaying but determined. "I can feel them, Thomas," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in days. "Our children. They're calling me." The passage had widened enough for a person to enter, revealing rough-hewn steps descending into darkness. From below came the sound of wind moving through confined spaces, but it was wrong somehow, arrhythmic like labored breathing. "The ishot of his heart," Juaneta explained, seeing their expressions. "The place where it keeps what it has taken." Sarah took the torch from Thomas. "I'm going." "Not alone," he insisted, taking her free hand. "We go together." Juaneta shook her head. "The father cannot." "We go together," Thomas repeated firmly. "They're our children." The Shoshone woman studied him, then nodded once. "Your love gives you strength. Perhaps it will be enough." She handed him a small leather pouch. "Dust from sacred ground. It will protect you, but only briefly. When you find the children, throw it in the center of the chamber and run. Do not look back, no matter what you hear." "What about you?" Jedediah asked as Thomas and Sarah prepared to enter the passage. "We will hold the way open," Juaneta replied, "and hold the Ishativa at bay as long as we can." The dust entities seemed to understand their intentions. It contracted again, then slammed against the rock face with such force that small stones rained down around them. Juaneta began another chant, raising her arms as if physically pushing back against the swirling mass. "Go," Jedediah urged, bracing himself beside the old woman. "We can't hold it long." Thomas and Sarah plunged into the passage, the torch's flame guttering in the strange, cold draft from below. Behind them, they heard Juaneta's chanting rise to a crescendo as the wind's howl became a screech of thwarted rage. The rough steps descended steeply into the earth, carved by tools that left peculiar, curved marks in the stone. The passage twisted and turned, leading them deeper beneath Devil's Gate. "How far down does it go?" Thomas wondered aloud, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Listen," Sarah replied, pausing on the narrow steps. From below came sounds, faint but unmistakable. Children crying. Dozens of them. James. Elizabeth. Samuel. Sarah called, her voice reverberating through the passage. The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by a single word that echoed up to them in 3 distinct voices. "Ma." Sarah pushed forward with renewed determination, practically running down the treacherous steps despite Thomas's warnings for caution. The passage widened suddenly, opening into a vast underground chamber that the torch's light couldn't fully illuminate. What they could see stopped them cold. The chamber walls were honeycombed with small alcoves, each occupied by a huddled figure. Children of varying ages, their faces gray with dust, eyes wide with terror and something else, a strange, hungry emptiness. There were dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, stretching back into the darkness beyond the torch's reach. And in the center of the chamber, 3 small figures stood together, holding hands. "James," Thomas breathed. "Elizabeth." "Samuel." The children turned toward their parents' voices, their faces lighting with hope and fear in equal measure. "Pa, Ma," James called, taking a step forward. "Don't move." A voice commanded from the darkness, a young woman, perhaps 16, who stepped into the torchlight. Her clothes were old-fashioned, her hair styled in a way Thomas hadn't seen in years. "If you break the circle, it will know." "Who are you?" Sarah asked, her eyes never leaving her children. "Hannah Edmonds. My family was crossing to Salt Lake in '47 when the dust took me." The girl's eyes held that same hungry emptiness as the other children, though she seemed to be fighting it. "I've been here, a long time. What is this place?" Thomas demanded, tightening his grip on the leather pouch Juaneta had given him. Hannah gestured around the chamber. "The Ishativa's larder. It keeps us here, feeding on our fear, our longing for home. It only comes when it's hungry, but it always comes." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "And it's always hungry." From the passage behind them came a sound, not wind, but a slow, deliberate movement. Dust began to seep into the chamber from countless small fissures in the walls and ceiling. "It's coming," Hannah said, backing away. "You shouldn't have come here. No one escapes." The dust poured into the chamber faster now. streams of it converging near the ceiling to form a swirling mass that grew larger by the second. The children in the alcoves pressed back against the walls, whimpering in terror. "Ma, Pa, help us," Samuel cried, struggling against James's restraining grip. Thomas assessed their situation with growing dread. The only exit was the passage they'd entered by, now partially blocked by the coalescing dust entity. Their children stood 20 feet away, separated from them by the open center of the chamber where the entity was forming. "The pouch," Sarah whispered urgently. Juanetta said to throw it in the center of the chamber. Thomas clutched the leather bag, suddenly unsure. "But what if we have to trust her?" Sarah insisted. "It's our only chance." The entity had nearly fully formed, now a towering column of swirling dust that reached from floor to ceiling. It began to take shape, forming that same grotesque approximation of a human figure they'd seen at Juanetta's lodge, but larger, more substantial. Where its face should be, dust swirled in a vortex that somehow conveyed hunger. "Children," it spoke, its voice the sound of dust grinding against dust. "My children, ... they're not yours," Sarah declared, her fear giving way to maternal fury. "They're mine. Ours." The entity turned its faceless gaze toward her. "You came ... to my domain? Brave ... foolish ... mother." It extended one elongated arm toward her, the fingers stretching impossibly across the chamber. Thomas stepped in front of Sarah, brandishing the torch. "I'll not touch her," he growled. The entity paused, then made a sound like dry laughter. "Your ... fire cannot harm me. I am endless, I ... am hunger, I am dust." "Now, Thomas," Sarah urged, "throw it now." Thomas hesitated one crucial moment, his eyes locked with James's across the chamber. His son nodded almost imperceptibly, understanding passing between them. "Children, run to us when I throw this," Thomas called, pulling the drawstring of the leather pouch open. "Run and don't look back." The entity sensed his intention, its form contracting as it lunged toward him. Thomas hurled the pouch into the center of the chamber with all his strength. It landed at the entity's base, splitting open to release a small cloud of reddish dust. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the entity screamed, a sound of rage and pain that shook dust from the ceiling. The reddish dust expanded rapidly, forming a countercyclone that tore at the entity's form. "Run!" Thomas shouted to his children. "Now!" James pushed his younger siblings forward, and the 3 Sullivan children sprinted across the chamber toward their parents. Other children began to move too. First a few, then dozens, emerging from their alcoves with newfound courage. "This way," Sarah called, waving them toward the passage. "Hurry!" The entity thrashed in the grip of Juanetta's medicine, its form disrupted by the countercyclone of sacred dust. But it was already beginning to reform, pulling itself back together with terrifying speed. "No!" it shrieked. "Mine! All mine!" It lashed out blindly, one elongated arm catching Hannah Edmonds as she ran past. The girl screamed as dust enveloped her, drawing her back toward the center of the chamber. Thomas lunged forward without thinking, grabbing Hannah's outstretched hand. The entity's dust burned against his skin, but he held firm, pulling the girl free with strength born of desperation. "Go!" he shouted, pushing her toward Sarah and their children, who had reached the passage entrance. The sacred dust was dissipating, its power nearly spent. The entity had almost fully reformed, larger and more terrible than before, its rage palpable in the confined space. Children streamed past Thomas toward the exit gaunt, dust-covered children from every decade of the territory's settlement. Some wore clothing styles from the 1840s, others from more recent years. All bore that same hungry emptiness in their eyes, though hope now battled with it. "Thomas, come on," Sarah called from the passage, their own children safely behind her. He backed toward the exit as the entity regained its full form, towering over him with malevolent intensity. "You ... cannot ... take ... mine. They ... mine." The chamber began to shake, dust and small stones raining down as the entity's rage manifested physically. The passage entrance started to crumble, stones shifting ominously. "It's collapsing," someone shouted from the passage. "Hurry!" Thomas turned and ran, the entity's howl of fury pursuing him as he joined the stream of fleeing children. Ahead, he could see Sarah herding them up the twisting steps, their torch held high to light the way. The passage shook violently, more stones falling with each step. Behind them, the entity's rage translated into a storm of dust and debris that pursued them up the narrow stairs. "Keep going," Thomas urged, pushing the slower children ahead of him. "Don't stop." The climb seemed endless, the steps steeper and more treacherous than they'd appeared on the descent. Children stumbled, were helped up by others. The youngest were carried by the oldest. Despite their years of captivity, a common purpose united them now: escape. Ahead, Thomas could see a faint glow moonlight filtering through the crevice. They were almost out. Faster, he called as the rumbling intensified. It's right behind us. The first children reached the opening, squeezing through to safety where Jedediah and Juanetta waited to pull them clear. Sarah went next, ensuring their own children were safely outside before looking back for Thomas. He was the last in the passage, having stayed behind to help the stragglers. As he reached the crevice, the entity made a final, desperate attempt to reclaim its captives. A tendril of dust shot up the passage with impossible speed, wrapping around Thomas's ankle with burning intensity. "Thomas!" Sarah screamed, reaching for him. He struggled against the pull, clawing at the rock walls for purchase. The entity was dragging him back down into the darkness, its strength incredible despite the sacred dust's disruption. Juanetta appeared at the crevice, her weathered face set in determined lines. She spoke words in that ancient language, her voice carrying power that made the very air vibrate. The dust tendril loosened momentarily, just enough for Thomas to lunge forward and grasp Sarah's outstretched hands. With Jedediah's help, they pulled him through the crevice just as the passage collapsed behind him. Dust exploded from the opening, followed by an unearthly shriek of rage and loss that gradually faded to a distant, mournful keening. Then silence, broken only by the sounds of children weeping in relief and the gentle gurgle of the Sweetwater River flowing through Devil's Gate. Thomas lay on the ground, gasping for breath. His ankle burned where the dust had gripped him. Sarah knelt beside him, their 3 children clinging to her and staring at their father with wide, traumatized eyes. "Is it over?" James asked, his voice small despite his attempt at bravery. Juanetta stood at the collapsed crevice, her hand pressed against the stone. "Not over," she said quietly. "Never over, but weakened, for now. It will sleep to recover its strength." Around them, dozens of rescued children huddled in the moonlight, their faces reflecting shock and disbelief at their newfound freedom. Some were recent captives like the Sullivan children, others had been presumed dead for decades. Hannah Edmonds approached Thomas, her face streaked with tears that had cleared paths through the dust. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not leaving me." Thomas nodded, too exhausted to speak. Sarah helped him sit up, and their children immediately surrounded him in a desperate embrace. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, looking at the crowd of rescued children. "Some of them. Their families must be long gone." Jedediah surveyed the group, his expression troubled. "We'll take them to Salt Lake. The church will care for those whose families can't be found." Juanetta shook her head slightly but said nothing, her ancient eyes filled with knowledge of cycles that would continue long after they were gone. In the distance, the wind began to rise again, sighing across the high desert plateau. Not a storm, not yet, but a reminder that dust was eternal and patience was the virtue of ancient things. Thomas held his family close, feeling the trembling in their small bodies, seeing the haunted look in their eyes that might never fully fade. They were alive, they were together, but they were changed, marked by their time in that in-between place. And somewhere beneath Devil's Gate, in a chamber now sealed by fallen stone, something ancient and hungry waited, diminished, but not destroyed, patient, as only the eternal can be, waiting for the wind to rise again. Salt Lake City, Utah Territory. 1 month later, the Sullivan family's wagon creaked up the rutted lane toward their homestead. The journey back from Salt Lake had taken 3 days, slowed by Thomas's still-healing ankle and the children's need for frequent stops. They had been quiet throughout the trip, speaking little and staying close together, as if afraid that separation might lead to another loss. Sarah sat beside Thomas on the wagon seat, her face drawn but determined. The past month in Salt Lake City had been difficult, explaining to church authorities what had happened, helping to reconnect the rescued children with families where possible, arranging care for those whose relatives were long dead. Through it all, Sarah had remained strong, but Thomas had heard her crying in the night when she thought he slept. "There it is," Thomas said as their homestead came into view. Home. The word hung in the air, its meaning changed by all they'd experienced. The house stood as they had left it, though wind and dust had taken their toll in their absence. The garden was lost, the chicken coop still partially collapsed. It would take weeks of work to restore everything. "Do we have to stay here?" Elizabeth asked, her voice small. She clutched her rag, doll a new one given to her in Salt Lake City to replace the one lost in the dust storm. "This is our home," Thomas replied, though without much conviction. He had asked himself the same question every day since their return from Devil's Gate. They stopped before the house, but no one moved to descend from the wagon. The memory of that night hung over them like a physical presence, the dust shapes mimicking their children, the whispering voices, the horror beneath Devil's Gate. "Perhaps we should pray first," Sarah suggested, reaching for the children's hands. Thomas nodded, removing his hat. "Lord, we thank you for returning our children to us, for guiding us through darkness back to light. We ask your blessing on this house, that it may be a place of safety and peace once more." Double quotes as his prayer continued. Samuel tugged at his mother's sleeve, pointing toward the house. "Ma," he whispered. "Look." A thin stream of dust was seeping from beneath the front door, moving with purpose across the yard toward the wagon. Not much, just enough to be visible in the afternoon sunlight. Sarah's hand tightened on Thomas's arm. James pulled his siblings closer. "And we ask for your protection against all evils, seen and unseen," Thomas concluded firmly, his eyes fixed on the approaching dust. "In Jesus' name, amen." The dust stopped its advance, hovering at the edge of the wagon's shadow. For a long moment nothing moved, not the dust, not the Sullivans. Then a breeze stirred, dispersing the dust into ordinary particles that settled back to earth. "It remembers us," James said quietly. Thomas climbed down from the wagon, testing his weight on his injured ankle. He approached the house cautiously, pausing at the porch steps where Samuel had lingered that night, watching the approaching storm. "We can find another place," he said, turning back to his family. "The church would help us relocate." Sarah studied the house, their home for 5 years, where their children had been born or grown, where they had built a life on the frontier. Then she looked at her children's faces, seeing the fear there, but also a fragile courage. "No," she said finally. "We will not be driven from our home." She descended from the wagon, helping Elizabeth down. "This is our land, our place, and we know now what we face." Thomas regarded his wife with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Sarah, are you certain? The children need to learn that evil can be faced," she finished for him, "so that it can be fought." She knelt before her children, meeting their eyes one by one. "What happened was terrible, but we survived. We stayed together, and we will not live in fear." James straightened, his young face solemn. "I'll help Pa repair the chicken coop." Elizabeth hesitated, then nodded. "I can plant new seeds in the garden." Samuel, always the most impulsive, darted past them all to dash up the porch steps. He stopped at the front door, turning back with a challenging expression. "Are we going in or not?" Thomas and Sarah exchanged glances, a silent communication born of years together and strengthened by shared ordeal. Then Thomas joined his youngest son at the door. "We're going in," he confirmed, pushing it open. The interior was much as they had left it, dusty of course, but otherwise unchanged. No sign remained of the dust formations or the strange markings in the children's room. It was just a house again, waiting to become a home once more. "We should air everything out," Sarah declared, moving purposefully to open the shutters. "James, fetch water from the well. Elizabeth, help me with these linens. Samuel, stay where I can see you." They worked through the afternoon, cleaning and repairing, reclaiming their space inch by inch. As dusk approached, Thomas lit the lamps and Sarah prepared a simple meal from the supplies they'd brought from Salt Lake City. "We'll need to replant the entire garden," she said as they ate. "And order new chickens from town. The Jensens said they'd help with repairs," Thomas added. "And the church is sending supplies for all the families affected by the incidents." They avoided using specific terms for what had happened. The dust, the Ashatava, the children's disappearance. Some experiences defied easy naming. After supper, the time came that they had all been quietly dreading bedtime. The children's room in the loft still held the memory of empty beds, of dust patterns moving with unnatural purpose. "I was thinking," Sarah said carefully, "that perhaps for a while we might all sleep down here, together." The relief on the children's faces was answer enough. Thomas moved the furniture in the main room, creating space for their bedrolls near the fireplace. "Like camping," he suggested, trying to make it seem adventurous rather than fearful. The children accepted this fiction gratefully, helping to arrange blankets and pillows in a circle around the hearth. As they settled in for the night, Samuel asked the question they'd all been avoiding. "What if it comes back?" The room fell silent. Wind sighed around the corners of the house, ordinary wind, carrying ordinary dust. But they all tensed nonetheless, listening for that distinctive moaning quality that had preceded the entity's appearance. "If it comes back," Thomas said finally, "we face it together, as a family. And we remember what Juanetta taught us," Sarah added. "Sacred dust to fight the hungry dust. Boundaries it cannot cross. Love it cannot break." James, lying between his siblings, reached out to hold their hands. Elizabeth clutched her new doll with her free arm. Samuel, for once, was perfectly still, his eyes wide in the firelight. "Tell us a story, Pa," Elizabeth requested, echoing her words from that fateful night. "A happy one." Thomas cleared his throat, settling more comfortably on his bedroll. Well, when I first met your mother in Nauvoo before the great journey west, double quotes as his deep voice filled the room with memories of younger days and simpler times. The tension gradually eased. The children's eyelids grew heavy. Sarah's rigid posture relaxed. Even the wind seemed gentle, becoming the ordinary soundtrack of a Utah night. Later, long after the children had fallen asleep, Thomas found Sarah still awake, staring into the dying embers of the fire. "We'll be all right," he whispered, touching her hand. She turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting both determination and lingering fear. "We will," she agreed. "But we'll never be the same." Thomas nodded, accepting this truth. "Perhaps that's not entirely bad. We know more now. About what's out there. About our own strength." Sarah's gaze drifted to their sleeping children. "I would give anything for them not to know. To still have that innocence." "Innocence was a luxury of safer places," Thomas replied gently. "Out here, perhaps wisdom serves better." Outside, the wind shifted, sending a soft patter of dust against the window. Both adults tensed, listening intently, but it was only the ordinary sound of an ordinary night. For now, at least, they were safe. Together. Home. But as they drifted towards sleep, each silently acknowledged what they had learned beneath Devil's Gate, that some hungers were eternal, some memories indelible, and that dust, patient as the ages, would always find its way back to what it had once possessed. Salt Lake Valley, Utah Territory, 10 years later. 1875, the Sullivan farm had prospered in the decades since the dust storm. New outbuildings stood where once there had been only a small barn and chicken coop. Fields of wheat and barley stretched to the north and east, while an orchard of young apple trees grew to the south. A proper fence surrounded the expanded house, which now boasted a second wing and a covered porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Thomas, his hair now fully gray at 47, stood in the yard watching the approach of a rider from town. Behind him, the sounds of preparation for Elizabeth's wedding filled the air. Women's voices from the kitchen, hammering from the area near the barn where tables were being constructed for the celebration. Rider coming, he called toward the house. "Looks like Bishop Harmon." Sarah appeared in the doorway, wiping flour from her hands. At 42, she retained her beauty, though her face bore the lines of a decade filled with both joy and vigilance. What would bring the bishop out today of all days? "We've enough to manage without church business." Thomas shrugged, moving to open the gate as the bishop approached. The 2 men had never been close, even though Thomas had served as a ward leader for the past 5 years. Bishop Harmon had always seemed uncomfortable around the Sullivans, perhaps because of the stories that had circulated after their return from Devil's Gate. "Brother Sullivan," the bishop greeted him, dismounting stiffly. At 60, he moved with the deliberate care of a man who felt every one of his years. "Sister Sullivan, I hope I find you well." "Well, but busy," Sarah replied, managing a smile. "Elizabeth marries tomorrow." Yes, a happy occasion," the bishop acknowledged. "Young brother Edmonds is fortunate indeed." The mention of their soon-to-be son-in-law brought mixed emotions. Michael Edmonds had come to Utah as a child of 8, one of those rescued from beneath Devil's Gate. His parents had not survived the journey west, but his older sister Hannah had raised him with help from the church. That shared experience had created a bond between him and Elizabeth that outsiders could never fully understand. "What brings you out this way, Bishop?" Thomas asked, getting to the point. The older man's expression grew grave. "Troubling news from the northern settlements. There have been ... incidents." Thomas felt a familiar coldness in his stomach. Sarah moved closer to him, her hand finding his arm. "What kind of incidents?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. "Dust storms. Unnatural ones, by all accounts." The bishop lowered his voice. "And children gone missing afterward. 3 families affected so far." "When?" Thomas demanded. "First one about a month ago. Its most recent just 3 days past." Bishop Harmon glanced toward the barn where James, now 22, was directing the construction. "I wouldn't have troubled you, especially with the wedding so near, but, well, your experience is known." "Known but not always believed," Sarah observed with a hint of bitterness. The bishop had the grace to look uncomfortable. "That may be so. There were many who thought your stories ... exaggerated, influenced by fear and superstition." He cleared his throat. "I confess I was among them, but these reports are remarkably similar to your accounts." Thomas exchanged a glance with Sarah, seeing in her eyes the same dread he felt. 10 years of watching the horizon whenever the wind rose. 10 years of checking on the children in the night. 10 years of keeping Juaneta's sacred dust in leather pouches placed at every threshold and window. "Have search parties been formed?" he asked. The bishop nodded. "Of course, but they've found nothing. No tracks, just as you described." "What do you want from us?" Sarah asked directly. "Guidance. Perhaps ... assistance," the bishop hesitated. The First Presidency has authorized me to request your help. They remember what happened with the other children you found. Thomas walked a few paces away, struggling with conflicting emotions. The memories of that time still haunted him. The howling dust, the whispering voices, the chamber beneath Devil's Gate with its alcoves of captive children. His ankles still ached in cold weather where the entity had gripped him. I can't leave now, he said finally. My daughter marries tomorrow. Of course, the bishop agreed quickly. After the wedding, but soon. The families are desperate. Sarah joined her husband, her expression resolute. We'll need to consult with others who were there. Jedediah Ambrose, if he still lives. And Juanetta. The bishop's face tightened at the mention of the Shoshone woman. Surely that won't be. It will be necessary, Thomas interrupted firmly. Without her knowledge, we would never have found our children. The sound of approaching footsteps made them all turn. James stood there, his tall frame reminiscent of his father's in younger days. I heard, he said simply. His eyes, always serious, had never fully lost the haunted look acquired during his captivity. I'll go with you. James, no, Sarah protested. You've been through enough. Which is why I have to go, he countered. I remember things. Things about that place, about It. Things that might help. Thomas started to object, then saw the determination in his son's face. The same determination that had kept him alive in that underground chamber, that had helped him protect his younger siblings. We'll discuss it after the wedding, he said instead. Discuss what? Came a new voice. Elizabeth approached, beautiful in a simple blue dress, her face flushed with the excitement of wedding preparations. At 19, she had grown into a lovely young woman with her mother's strength and a gentleness all her own. The adults exchanged glances, reluctant to cloud her happiness with old terrors. Church business, Thomas replied vaguely. Nothing for you to worry about on your special day. Elizabeth studied their faces, too perceptive to be fooled. It's back, isn't it? She asked quietly. The dust thing. The bishop looked startled at her directness. Sarah moved to her daughter's side, placing an arm around her shoulders. We don't know for certain, she hedged. There have been some incidents up north. Elizabeth's gaze found her brother's. Something passed between them, the silent communication of those who had shared an unspeakable experience. I'll tell Michael, she said. He'll want to know. After the wedding, Thomas insisted, please, Elizabeth. One day of joy untainted by old shadows. She hesitated, then nodded. One day. But then we face it. Together. Together, James echoed. The bishop watched this exchange with a mixture of confusion and discomfort. He had not been present during the events of a decade past, had not seen the dust take form, had not heard it speak with children's voices. For him it remained a story disturbing, but remote. I should return to town, he said. I'll come again after the celebration to discuss arrangements. Thomas saw him to his horse, the two men speaking in low voices about practical matters, how many men would be needed, what supplies to gather. Sarah remained with her children, drawing them close as if her embrace could protect them from the coming storm. From the house came the sound of laughter. Samuel, now 16 and studying with the town's schoolmaster, entertaining the younger cousins who had arrived for the wedding. His wild nature had been tempered by experience into a careful exuberance. He alone among the siblings seemed to have fully reclaimed his joy, though Sarah often caught him watching dust motes in sunbeams with an expression too old for his years. We hoped it was over, Elizabeth said softly, that it would sleep forever. Juanetta warned us, James reminded her. She said it would regain its strength eventually. 10 years, Sarah murmured. 10 years of peace. Around them, the late summer breeze stirred the dust in the yard, ordinary dust moving in ordinary ways, but all three Sullivans tensed nonetheless, their eyes tracking its movement with the wariness of those who had seen dust form hands that reached for them, mouths that spoke their names. We're stronger now, James said, breaking the moment. We know what we face. Elizabeth nodded, squaring her shoulders. And there are more of us who remember, who know the truth. Sarah watched her children with a mixture of pride and sorrow. They had lost something irreplaceable in that dust storm 10 years ago, not just innocence, but the certainty that the world operated according to comprehensible rules. Yet they had gained something to resilience, wisdom, and a deep understanding of both darkness and light. Come, she said, guiding them back toward the house. We have a wedding to prepare. Tomorrow is for joy. We'll face the dust when it comes. As they walked away, none of them noticed the small, isolated whirlwind that formed briefly at the edge of the property. It spun for a few seconds, taking on a vaguely human shape before dispersing, patient, eternal, hungry, waiting for the wind to rise again.